What's poppin', A-Push comrades? Today we're going to be talking about the politics of the 1950s. So, with the end of World War II, there was a rise of tensions between the once allied United States and Soviet Union, also known as Russia, also known as the USSR. We use all three, so try not to get them confused.
This rise in tensions led to the infamous drawn-out conflict known to you as the Cold War. It got its name due to the fact that there was no actual major conflict. However, there were some smaller hot wars in the middle of it, like the Korean War and the Vietnam War.
Along with the rise of nuclear warfare, the Cold War and the fear that came along with it, known as the Red Scare, helped shape the values that define the 1950s, such as conformity and consumerism.
Overall, this time period was mostly defined by fear and conformity, but in response to that, calls for political, social, and cultural change arose.
So we're going to start off this video by talking about the Cold War as a whole. The Cold War was a series of drawn-out conflicts that lasted from the end of World War II roughly to the early 1990s, which is a period of 50 years.
If you want, you could classify it as a Third World War because almost every country in the world was technically involved, except for the Third World countries in places like Africa.
Something really important to note is the fact that the entire world was basically divided into the First World, the Second World, and the Third World. The First World were capitalist countries such as the United States and other countries in NATO, which we will be talking about later. The Second World was communist countries, such as those in the Warsaw Pact, and, of course, the USSR. And the Third World were those countries that didn't really identify with any communist or capitalist beliefs or remain neutral in the conflict.
The two main parties in conflict were the USA and other capitalist countries as one group, and the USSR and the other communist countries in another. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry is controlled and regulated by private owners for profit instead of the government.
And communism is an ideology of economic equality through the elimination of private property.
Basically, they fight over whether the government should have all or no say in how the economy is run.
So, the United States and the USSR also had important allies. The United States was involved in NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a military alliance between the United States, Canada, and several Western European countries that all held capitalist beliefs.
They were able to secure these allies through the Marshall Plan, which funneled funds directly to war-torn Europe in order for them to rebuild and, most importantly, not become communist. Domino theory was the belief that if one country fell to communism, all of its surrounding countries would also fall. So keeping European countries from falling to communism was a top priority.
That being said, the USSR had both satellite nations and its own form of NATO, known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a collective defense treaty between the USSR and several Eastern European countries, such as Poland and East Germany. Keep in mind, after World War II, the United States, as well as other NATO countries and then other Warsaw Pact countries, divided Germany into several parts, each occupied by a different country.
One thing that really rose the stakes of the Cold War was the development of nuclear technology, specifically the atom bomb. This was first used by the US at the end of World War II when it was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing nearly 250,000 Japanese civilians either immediately or after prolonged radiation.
For a period of roughly 4 years, or from 1945 to 1949, the United States was the only country that had access to nuclear technology. In 1949, however, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, leading to the United States to develop an even more powerful counterpart, the hydrogen bomb.
The hydrogen bomb was actually nearly 1,000 times more powerful than the ones dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
This rapid development in wartime technology and a desperate need to have the most firepower sparked the arms race that characterized much of the early Cold War. However, unlike previous arms races, the deadly nature of the weapons being developed sparked not only fear, but hatred in the American people.
However, in the late 50s, the arms race began to die down as it was replaced by the space race, or the race for interstellar exploration.
In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellites into Earth's orbit, called Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2. In response to this, in 1958, the United States decided to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars to public education, specifically for math and science. NASA was also founded due to the Sputnik crisis.
And if you're wondering what exactly Sputnik means, it's not that creative.
It means satellite. They decided to name the first thing to go in the Earth's orbit. It wasn't something cool like Pathfinder, Challenger, like the Opportunity rover.
Challenger.
No. Anyway.
Now, although the space race started in the 1950s, it gained more traction in the 60s, specifically in 1969 when the US landed on the moon.
The Cold War, despite not being an actual war, was a period of intense stress, fear, and hatred around the globe. The looming threat of nuclear war and the communist and capitalist boogeymen led to the creation of a culture that would define the world until the 1990s.
In spite of this, the Cold War did have some positive outcomes, like the rapid development of science and technology at the time.
Now let's discuss one of the first hot wars in the Cold War, the Korean War.
The former Japanese colony was divided along the 38th parallel after World War II into North and South Korea as we know them today.
Soviet armies occupied the northern territory, while the United States armies occupied the southern territory. Both armies ended up withdrawing by 1949. This left North Korea in the hands of the communist dictator Kim Il-sung, and South Korea in the hands of the conservative nationalist Syngman Rhee.
On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea, shocking the world and sparking President Harry S. Truman to take action. He called a meeting of the United Nations where they decided to aid the capitalist South Korea.
Troops were sent from most UN countries, but most of the forces were from the United States. Because the United States didn't declare war, however, most people accepted this as merely a police action instead of an actual conflict. The war went pretty badly at first, with North Korean forces pushing the United States, UN, and South Korean troops all the way to the tip of the Korean peninsula.
General Douglas MacArthur, who led the US troops, arranged a counterattack at Incheon that changed the course of the war.
The combined forces were then able to take most of the former North Korean territory, as well as destroying most of the North Korean army. In November of 1950, however, Chinese forces drove most of the combined forces out of North Korea.
MacArthur was able to stabilize the fighting at the 38th parallel, but still wanted to expand the war. However, Truman wanted to enforce containment and limit the war.
And in 1951, he was recalled for insubordination. MacArthur, however, was seen by the American people as a hero, which sparked much controversy between the limited war-minded Democrats, such as Truman, and the pro-war Republicans. For the next few years, the fighting in Korea reached a stalemate at the 38th parallel. In 1953, however, an armistice was finally signed.
Overall, containment worked in this case, but the pro-war Republicans were far from satisfied, so they began to criticize the Democrats back in the US.
Now we're going to talk about the second major hot war in the Cold War, the Vietnam War. Although most of the fighting took place in the 1960s, the war had a very important beginning in the 1950s.
So, after World War II, France tried to take back its colony of Indochina. This fighting, which started as just an anti-colonial struggle, turned into another part of the Cold War, with the capitalist France fighting to take back communist Indochina.
The United States gave military aid to France, while the anti-colonial leader Ho Chi Minh was backed by China and the Soviet Union. After a disastrous defeat, France gave up Indochina at the Geneva Conference in 1954, which split the former colony into 3 independent countries: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam.
Another measure decided at the Geneva Conference was that Vietnam was to be divided at the 17th parallel until a general election could be safely held. Similarly to Korea, Ho Chi Minh established a communist government in the north, while an anti-communist government arose in the south.
The general election that was promised never happened, partly due to fear that the communists would win. So from 1955 to 61, the United States sent billions in economic and military aid to South Vietnam in order to prevent it from falling to communism, similar to what the United States did for Western European countries under the Marshall Plan.
This was another result of the influence of domino theory.
These circumstances set a perfect stage for the Vietnam War, which started in 1955, but didn't become a major issue in America until the 1960s. So while there was all this fighting happening overseas, there was a lot of political turmoil happening at home, specifically with the Second Red Scare.
Just as the first Red Scare followed US victory in World War I, the second one came after US's victory in World War II.
With the rise of communism, the USSR, and the looming threat of nuclear annihilation, many Americans grew to see communism as a boogeyman of sorts, and members of the US government were not excluded from this blind fear.
The Truman administration believed in a communist conspiracy behind most of the civil wars in Europe and Asia. Along with this, they also believed that communist spies and conspirators had invaded the US government.
Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy was another important name in the Second Red Scare. He used power moves, such as saying that 205 members of the State Department were communists in a 1950 campaign speech, to keep media focused on him. Working-class Americans loved his hard-hitting remarks that were often targeted at the wealthy and privileged members of American society.
This fear of communism, combined with the large amounts of media attention, turned Joseph McCarthy into one of the most powerful men in 1950s America. Another major part of the Second Red Scare was the HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Its first purpose was to hunt Nazis post-World War II, but it was eventually used to hunt for communists. Many artists, writers, and actors were called before the committee, and those that refused to testify were charged for contempt of Congress. We're gonna have more about this exact topic in our culture video, so make sure to check that one out too.
McCarthyism and the Red Scare had by far the biggest impact on American society and the idea of freedom of expression.
The ideas of conformity became a comfort in a society where many people didn't know who they could trust. Those brave enough to express themselves and break from the mold were not only scrutinized, but also feared.
While Americans at home were freaking out over communism, things weren't going too well in the Middle East either. The relations with the Middle East in the 1950s can be described as a struggle to maintain friendly ties with oil-producing countries, while also supporting new potential Cold War allies.
The first instance of this struggle was with the new Jewish country of Israel, which was formed in 1958 to much backlash from neighboring countries like Egypt. This conflict started to a British civil war in its former territory that left the land divided between the Israelites and the Palestinians. This conflict between the two groups continues to this day.
The second instance of this struggle is with the Suez Crisis. This crisis began when Egypt asked the US for funds to build a dam, the Aswan Dam, on the Nile River. The US refused because Egypt threatened Israel's security.
This led to Egypt asking the USSR for funding, to which they provided limited funding. Because Egypt still needed money, they decided to nationalize the British and French-owned Suez Canal in 1956. The loss of this canal threatened the west supply line to Middle Eastern oil, which was very important.
In response to this, Britain and France, along with Israel, launched a surprise attack and took back the canal.
Eisenhower, who was angry about being kept in the dark about the whole attack, sponsored a UN resolution condemning the invasion of Egypt. This caused the invading forces to finally withdraw, and the United States became the leading Western influence in the Middle East.
In 1957, Eisenhower established his famous Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that the US would give economic and military aid to any country threatened by communism. This was first tested in 1958 when the US successfully prevented a civil war in Lebanon.
Another alarming political development that happened during the Cold War was in the late 1950s in Latin America.
Unlike the previous successes of containment, Cuba fell to communism in 1959 when Fidel Castro established it as a totalitarian state.
In addition to that, he nationalized American businesses and properties, which caused the United States to cut off all trade with Cuba, and Cuba, in turn, turned to the Soviets for any aid.
The fall of Cuba to communism alarmed many Americans and brought the realities of the Cold War to only 90 miles off of America's coast.
Before Cuba, the United States intervened in many Latin American countries that they felt were at risk for falling to communism or were already communist or socialist. The only country that was invaded in the 1950s was Guatemala. However, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the United States played a big role in Latin American governments. One of the most important political developments back at home was that in civil rights. The 1950s marked the beginning of government action in the civil rights movement. Most of the major changes occurred in the 1960s and beyond. However, there were some big changes that occurred in the 50s as well.
One of the most well-known and important changes to know was the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka.
Since the 1896 Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson, the NAACP was working towards overturning the legislation, which made separate but equal facilities legal. In short, it legalized segregation.
In 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously declared that segregation of public schools was illegal. This was due to the superior arguing of a team of NAACP lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall. They argued that the segregation of public schools was unlawful because it violated 14th Amendment rights.
Although the current Chief Justice wrote that school segregation should end with all deliberate speed, there was much opposition to this ruling in the South. This was in the form of temporary closing of public schools and setting up private schools for white students, a resurgence in the Ku Klux Klan, and state governments attempting to keep black students from attending public schools.
A specific and well-known example of this resistance was the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas. 9 black students who were attending a white school were met with much protest and were barred from entering. However, Eisenhower called the U.S. National Guard to let them in.
Despite this major decision, little progress was made in the desegregation of schools. By 1964, less than 2% of black students attended integrated schools, and today, even in the North, there's still many schools that are barely integrated.
Overall, the Cold War and unrest at home defined 50s politics.
There was much unrest among the American people, whether it be fear of nuclear war, fear of the communists, or fear of any of the social changes that were going on during this time period.
That's gonna be all for our video on politics of the 1950s.
If you want to learn more about the Little Rock Nine as well as civil rights and the other social changes, we'll have a video for that also.
Good luck on the exam in May, and remember, you are more than just a number.
Have a good day!